is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The Tokyo Games begin with a spectacular opening ceremony, but the greatest show on earth will be like no other Olympics.
China's flooding death toll is rising. 56 people have now lost their lives. More than 1 million people have been displaced.
As the world battles extreme weather, fighting climate change is top of the agenda for G20 environment ministers.
And growing calls for vaccinated workers to be exempt from the UK's self-isolation rules as a new wave of coronavirus forces thousands to stay at home.
It's the greatest show on earth, but this year's Olympics have begun in Tokyo with a subdued opening ceremony. The Japanese capital remains under a state of emergency due to COVID-19.
The Games, delayed because of the pandemic, are controversial in the host country. Many say this event should not be taking place with fears of a fifth wave of infection. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Yuri Kagayama, who's there for us. Yuri, this was an opening ceremony like no other.
Yes, I was probably one of the few regular Japanese that was allowed into the stands. Half the stadium was empty, and only few seats were taken, mostly by media and IOC officials and the emperor and other Mrs. Biden, people like that. And the big chunk of the stands had nobody in them. And there was a lot of reference to the COVID crisis in the ceremony itself. Everybody was wearing masks except for the performers. Some of the performers, like the dancers, didn't have masks, but all the athletes, all the speakers were wearing masks. And of course, I was too while I was in there.
How are the Games being received in Tokyo?
There's a lot of protests and mixed feelings about having the Games amid a pandemic at a cost to people's health, because only about a fifth of the Japanese regular population has been vaccinated. Even as the opening ceremony was going on, especially in the beginning when the volume was a little bit low in what was happening there as far as the action, I could hear the protesters chanting. You know, and we never had that in an opening ceremony of the Olympics, that you hear people asking that the Games be canceled as it's starting to open.
Yuri Kagayama in Japan, thank you very much.
Well, let's talk now to Simon Chadwick, who is Global Professor of the Eurasian Sport Industry at Lyon Business School. Great to have you with us on the programme, Simon. So the Games are now finally underway. What's been the reaction to the opening ceremony in a country that didn't really want the Games in the first place?
Well, we know that from polls prior to the Olympics, many of the Japanese population didn't want the Games to take place. It's really interesting because Tokyo is now in its fourth state of emergency. And I think by comparison, if you look at the numbers around the pandemic in Tokyo compared to somewhere like, for example, London, the situation here has actually been serious, much more serious. And so I think what we can conclude is that the Japanese people and the Japanese government in general have been very cautious in the way that they've dealt with the virus. So there was a great deal of resentment there, but at the same time, obviously, for a country that has spent the best part of 10 years preparing for this, there was a lot of anticipation, and there was a certain degree of excitement too. I know a lot of people watched on TV. There were people watching the fireworks. So I think mixed emotions, but obviously big concern about the pandemic.
So COVID, the most obvious challenge for the Games, but its controversies have been much wider than that.
it's really starting from day one. The Games, when it was initially conceived of in 2011 following the tsunami and the Fukushima disaster, and Shinzo Abe took over as Prime Minister in 2012. And the political tone, the political nature of the Games, I think, began to ramp up at that point. And if we fast forward and up to now, Abe had to resign last August, so this followed on, obviously, from the postponing of the Games last summer. But in addition to that, there have been issues around gender discrimination. There have been issues around the treatment of different groups in Japan. And so it's actually been quite controversial. I think in some ways Japan has actually struck lucky because most of the world has been looking at the pandemic rather than focusing on some of these domestic issues related to the Games that it has been grappling with.
And we've also had sponsors deciding to stay away, as well as uncertainty about whether the Games would even go ahead. So how has all this affected the Olympic brand?
The observation about sponsors is an interesting one because we know that, for example, Toyota has perhaps been the highest profile sponsor to step back. Toyota is still activating its deal worldwide, but is not showing TV ads related to the Olympics in Japan. And I think obviously there's a big concern about this being a super spreader event, and if it is to be a super spreader event, how will that reflect upon a sponsor? And I think there's also something too for Toyota in terms of social solidarity. But for the IOC and Olympics itself, this is a tough one. There's a great deal of cynicism, particularly in the West, around the Olympics and the costs that it imposes upon countries, and I'm thinking particularly here of financial costs. But I think what the pandemic has done is to create this notion that there is also a health cost or a socio-cultural cost as well. And I'm not sure so far that the IOC and the Olympics have handled this particularly well. And I think it's got a lot of work to do over the next 2 weeks to ensure trust, to show empathy, to demonstrate to a global audience that this is an organisation that really does care about the host nations in which it stages these events.
And you mentioned the financial cost. This is a Games that's gone way over budget. Why would any country want to bid to host the Games again?
That's actually a great question, because if you look at all of the scientific research around Olympic Games hosting, the benefits at best are marginal. There is a consensus that it costs more than the benefits that you're actually going to generate in most cases. And so I think what you're looking towards is you're looking towards changing perceptions of a nation, enhancing nation brand, building reputation, projecting soft power, and perhaps effecting internal changes. And I know in Japan's case, one of the things that the Japanese government is trying to do is to change Japanese culture and become more outward-looking and engaged with the world. So I think it's in those more intangible areas, possibly, where you're going to see the most significant benefits.
We've just been looking at pictures of demonstrations happening outside the opening ceremony, but now the Games have started, do you think the country will get behind them?
I do think some of the coverage around protests outside the Games venues is a little disingenuous, because as the ceremony was taking place today, I thought back to London 2012, and obviously I was in Britain at that time. There were protests then on the opening day of the Games, so this is something that typically happens. But I do think that there are genuine concerns in Japan, and this is not something that's just happened over a day or a week or a month. This has been sustained over the last 14, 15, 16 months. As we know, the pandemic has been hugely destructive in lots of different ways, and people are genuinely concerned about their health and well-being. And I think it's vital, not just for the Japanese government, but also for the IOC and for other stakeholders who are there in Tokyo to let these people be heard, and for them to demonstrate that they are being heard, and that measures are being taken to ensure that the city remains as safe as possible.
Simon Chadwick from Lyon Business School. It's great to get your thoughts today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now the rest of the day's news, and the death toll in China's floods has now risen to 56 in what's been described as the worst flooding in 1,000 years. Around 1 million people have now been displaced. Recovery work is underway to try to restore the damaged communications infrastructure. The authorities say they're also working to reconnect electricity and clean water supplies.
Li Jianhua reports from the capital of Henan, one of the worst affected cities.
Floodwaters have receded in Henan's capital, Zhengzhou, and this is how the city looks like now. Roads are caked with mud, and tens of thousands of cars are left unattended. Millions of lives are affected here. We talked to a local resident who barely escaped a flooded underground train in which 12 people were killed a few days ago.
No one expected Zhengzhou, a northern city in China, to experience such heavy downpours. None of us knew the underground station would be flooded so badly. At 7:22 on Tuesday, I managed to get out of the station. By the time I climbed onto the platform, floodwater had reached my waist.
The flood damaged the city's water supply facilities. Tap water is available only 3 times a day.
No tap water at this moment. The government is fixing it. Some companies recovered rapidly and are functioning now. People save water when it's available.
Citizens are now in severe need of drinking water, and even the biggest franchise supermarkets in Zhengzhou is struggling.
Drinking water is the most needed item, especially large bottled water. Water and electricity are not available in nearby communities. We've been in contact with our logistics companies, and they're trying to help. A truck of bottled water has just arrived.
Other daily necessities are ample at this point. Fast food and staples are the most welcome, as cooking at home is almost impossible without water and electricity. Some customers mainly come to this supermarket to charge their mobile phones, and for free.
This is the first time that I charge my phone here. My power bank can only last for a day or so. I need to make sure my colleagues can reach me at all times.
Now about 20,000 people are working on the ground in Zhengzhou to help the city function again. The floodwater has receded in town except for some low-lying areas. And now, as you can see in the background, the traffic is getting hectic. But the problem right now is internet and electricity supplies are still quite limited in the city. Li Jianhua, CGTN, Zhengzhou, Henan Province.
Typhoon Infa is forecast to pass just to the north of Taiwan, bringing torrential rain.
The 6th typhoon of this year is also expected to make landfall between the northern parts of Zhejiang Province and Fujian Province on Sunday.
Our reporter Andy Lee is in Taipei.
Infa, it is going to bring heavy rain. It is expected to hit northern and eastern parts of Taiwan, especially severely affecting the northern and eastern parts of Taiwan, bringing heavy rain. Plus the fact that Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, has very high mountain regions. So when Typhoon Infa, or in Mandarin, Typhoon Yanhua, hits the mountain regions of Taiwan, it is expected to squeeze more and more rain from Typhoon Infa. So we are expecting heavy rain. And in fact, there are warnings going out for people living in mountainous regions, especially landslides and mudslides, and also warnings for people living in low-lying areas for flash floods and rising river. The local government here in Taiwan are issuing warnings to people, warning of heavy rain from Typhoon Infa, especially calling out to people not to go to the seaside because there are waves crashing in, very dangerous, and waves are very high, and asking people to please do not go hiking for the next 2 days in mountainous regions because the cost of rescuing people in the mountain regions tied up in typhoon is too costly. And now, the local population here on the island of Taiwan, they are stocking up on items in preparation for this Typhoon Infa, like candles, batteries, and I don't know why, people in Taiwan, they always say must stock up on instant noodle for typhoon. So instant noodle is a necessity whenever typhoon comes.
Europe.cgtn.com has all the week's top stories from China. Here's a quick take of some of them. All that and more at Europe.cgtn.com.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, how supply chains in the UK are being stretched by the pingdemic, warning hundreds of thousands of critical workers to stay at home.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
The UK government has been forced to exempt food supply chain workers from having to self-isolate if they're pinged by the Health Service's COVID app alert.
What's been dubbed a pingdemic is causing havoc across the country, with hundreds of thousands of people told to quarantine. Well, our correspondent Naweed Jabarkal has been following the story for us. So, Naweed, worries about shortages in the shops and hundreds of thousands of people staying off work. Tell us more.
Yeah, Robin, the government's facing mounting pressure to do something about this and essentially stop the shortage of workers across key parts of the economy. It has done that in the past 24 hours. First, it outlined 16 key sectors of the economy which there would be a partial relaxation of rules across. They include things like water and waste management to medical supplies, the emergency services and the energy industry as well. But not quite everyone, only people named explicitly on letters from the government and people who are double vaccinated. Not quite the breakthrough that businesses were hoping for. And then on Friday, it's outlined further changes for the food supply industry, looking at food production and the delivery of food as well from depots and factories, for example. George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, saying that there were very obvious reasons why food supply needed to be protected. But there's also the wider concern here that some businesses will still be impacted, and then individuals as well. This is an official health app that's been downloaded tens of millions of times, and the longer the complications go on, the less public confidence there could be in its usage.
Just days after England lifted the last of its COVID restrictions, a so-called pingdemic has dominated headlines here. The move has led to hundreds of thousands of people having to self-isolate because they've come into contact with someone who's tested positive for the virus. But how exactly does it work? People in England and Wales can download an official COVID-19 app on their phone. So far, around 26 million people have done so. If John tests positive for the virus, anyone he's spent enough time with who also has the app active will get a ping telling them about his result. But only those who've been in close contact with him, that's 2 meters away for a minimum of 15 minutes, will receive a message. If people are pinged, they don't have to self-isolate by law, but are advised to for up to 10 days. With the rules seemingly unclear, many people are choosing to isolate. In the second week of July, a record figure of almost 620,000 were pinged. That's led to staff shortages in key sectors of the economy. Some supermarkets and petrol stations have had to close, and the Road Haulage Association says 20,000 pings is contributing to a shortfall of around 100,000 lorry drivers to transport key goods. Making the situation worse is rising case numbers, an average of almost 50,000 a day across the UK, and growing quickly.
I would isolate to be on the safe side for your family, you know, and people you live with.
I would, yeah, to protect the people around me. I've got the app, haven't turned anything off, so I get the pings if necessary.
No, I don't believe that it's really helping people at all.
Why?
Because it's not proven that the amount of it's just taking too many people out of work, for starters, for unnecessary reasons. That's what I think.
In an attempt to try and ease the pressure on businesses, some key workers, the government says now, will no longer need to self-isolate when pinged. Those in the food industry, as we've mentioned, for example, if they have a negative test, they can go straight back to work, even if they haven't been vaccinated. That's a key change. But many sectors, such as hospitality, will continue to face problems. As for the rest of the population, the advice remains the same. Until the 16th of August, if you get notified, you should quarantine, which means the pingdemic and the disruption it's causing looks likely to continue.
So are there now concerns that the government's wider strategy of opening up could be premature?
Yeah, there are. We've heard from the British Medical Association, essentially the trade union for doctors across the country, a powerful industry, particularly in the past year and a half, given their role in fighting the pandemic. It says the government needs to urgently rethink its strategy in containing COVID-19 and especially easing restrictions, almost all of them this week. It says that the public infection control strategy in place is not working. It's leading to rocketing case numbers, more illness in the community, more people in hospital and more people having to isolate. That's pretty damning. And in terms of that last point, more people having to isolate, it says that the idea that nurses and doctors can be sent straight back to work is actually very risky, part of that pandemic issue we've just been speaking about. Now, it must be said the government, for its part, said it was expecting this. It expected numbers to go up, case numbers to go up. Health Secretary Sajid Javid predicts 100,000 cases a day, but crucially for the government's perspective, hospitalizations and deaths are not going to go up that much, it predicts. It thinks that they will only reach a maximum of about 2,000 hospitalizations out of that 100,000 cases each day. There's also the pressure from the government, from its own party, backbenchers, who wanted to see the economy open up because there is, while the health considerations are important, some politicians say that the economy is suffering and things can't go on as they are. The Health Secretary himself said up to 13 million people could be missing out on other medical care because of ongoing restrictions around the pandemic. The latest figures we've had out in the last hour show that cases are still spreading across the UK, 36,500. Now, that's the third day in a row that they've actually decreased, but if you look at the overall trajectory, it's still fairly rising. And adding to concerns, fresh concerns, the Public Health England, the body which oversees health in the country, has just said that a new coronavirus variant is being investigated in the UK. It's known as B1621, and it's been designated as a variant under investigation on Wednesday. We're still learning more about this, but there's crucially, so far, Public Health England says no evidence to suggest it makes vaccines less effective or causes more severe illness. And most of the cases so far have been linked to overseas travel, and there's no evidence that it's currently spreading in the community in the UK. But as we've seen, that could very easily change with previous variants, and it may cause new, fresh concerns for the government about its border control policy if this is something that's been imported from overseas. Back to you.
Nareed Jabakal, thank you.
Well, let's talk to Richard Burge, the CEO of London Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Richard, welcome. When you talk to the members you represent, what impact has the so-called COVID-19 pingdemic had on businesses in London?
I think it's having two impacts. One is direct for those businesses who've got staff now who are isolating for up to 10 days on the basis of a ping. And that can be some of our big businesses like Transport for London. I'm in Hounslow in West London at the moment. 5 trains I was due to get on were cancelled because of staff shortages. And it can also, because it creates uncertainty. Those businesses which have staff who haven't been pinged, they're just waiting for a phone call to say, sorry, boss, I can't come in, I've had the message. So it's uncertainty as well as direct impact.
And what are you hearing from the businesses about their key challenges that lie ahead in the coming weeks and months?
Well, it's stumbling. It's a feeling that it's not a collapse of business, but we're trying to accelerate, we're trying to get business going, and yet we're stumbling along because there are too many ministers giving contradictory messages on TV, and we're not hearing enough from the government scientists who should be giving out a consistent message and consistent advice. So our view and the London Chamber is that if you get a ping, you should actually just be asked to test every day for 7 days. And obviously, if one of those is positive, then you go into isolation and you do the proper PCR test. But frankly, that is what's going to get our economy going, and that's what's going to give us consistency. If the science changes, then what we want to hear is scientists on the radio and TV, not government ministers, because I'm afraid they are continually getting it wrong, and scientists, I think, have a greater level of trust in the community, particularly amongst business leaders.
Which sectors are in most trouble and why?
Well, I think the sectors which are in most trouble are the ones where staff have to be physically at work in order to do it. So hospitality, retail, actually face-to-face retail, and transportation, whether that's logistics such as lorries transporting goods or transporting people. So those are the ones at greater risk. If you get pinged and you can work from home, it doesn't matter. You can continue working. You're not actually sick. So people who can do their office work, working from home, shouldn't be affected. But anything to do with a person physically having to be at a location can suddenly have their business stop overnight on the basis of one message.
Supply shortage worries are creeping back into the public discourse. They're on the front pages of many UK newspapers over the last couple of days. Is there really legitimate cause for concern, or is this a newspaper story that doesn't have great substance in it?
I think there may be the odd temporary shortage, but it will not get to the point of view of the shelves being emptied, because I think our big supermarkets have got their act together. They're doing their best. We may find the range of goods declining slightly. We may not get precisely what we want on the shelves, but frankly, everything we need to live and to live well, as we do in this country compared to many billions of people around the world, will still be on our shelves and we'll still have the money to pay for it.
Richard Burge in London, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Staying in the UK, and retail sales rose by 0.5% between May and June. They're now up 9.5% from pre-pandemic levels. Analysts have attributed it to spending on food and drinks during Euro 2020. But pent-up consumption has also driven up prices. That's increased concern over inflation and caused some policymakers to consider rolling back stimulus packages.
What's the best time to get the second jab? A UK study of the Pfizer vaccine indicates that a wait of between 8 and 10 weeks can trigger more antibodies than a shorter interval. When balancing the benefits of a quick rollout among the population and better effectiveness, researchers suggest that 8 weeks is probably best.
Shares in India's first billion-dollar tech startup, food delivery firm Zomato, soared around 80% on its first day of trading on Mumbai's stock exchange. The Indian unicorn achieved a market value of around $13 billion.
The chipmaker Intel Corp has raised its full-year revenue forecast to $73 billion, driven by a strong second quarter. But analysts say it implies a weak end of the year, with the outlook sending shares down 2.8%. Intel's chief executive says it still faces supply chain constraints and warns it could take the industry 2 years to catch up with explosive demand.
Shares in Chinese ride-hailing app Didi have fallen sharply for a second day on Wall Street. They've plummeted 18% after dropping 11% on Thursday. The sell-off follows reports that regulators are considering serious penalties amid questions about how it uses customer data. Let's talk to our correspondent in New York, John Terrett. So, John, what's going on with Didi?
Well, Bloomberg began reporting the story yesterday. That's where I first saw it. And it does look as if there are some unprecedented punishments coming down the pike for Didi if these reports are to be believed. It looks as if there could be a fine coming their way of $2.8 billion. Now, that is more than Alibaba was fined by the Chinese authorities earlier this year for antitrust infringements, a little bit more anyway. And it looks as well as if there could be possible suspension of some of its operations around the world. Remember, Didi is a huge global company. The people who run the company have always said, you know, look, we were born in China, but we want to be a global company. So that's a possible penalty as well, including the delisting of its stocks around the world and presumably the pulling of the IPO, which is only about 3 weeks old now here at the New York Stock Exchange. All of that is on the cards, and it's happening because the Chinese internet authorities are looking into possible cyber security breaches with the company's app. The app has been suspended now in China. And I guess this is where we come in New York. Listen to these numbers. I mean, they went out at $14 about 3 weeks ago. They traded initially at $16.66. I know you gave a percentage just now, Robin, but I've got a different one here. I think it's down about 27% in the month since then. It was down 10% yesterday, Thursday, on this news. And now it's down another 20%. That's $2. So the share is now at $8.11. And it went out at 14. It immediately began trading at 16. So you could see that's pretty much half gone in just the last couple of months. Now, what do people here say? Well, they're fed up. Of course they are. They wonder why we couldn't have had this announced before the IPO. It actually was announced 2 days after. But there's also a sense of resignation here. I mean, they do know that there are risks involved in investing in Chinese companies, and indeed any overseas company as well, for just this reason, because local jurisdictions can target and turn on a dime their high-tech companies like this one. I think the feeling here is that they're happy that we seem to be moving towards a conclusion now. And hopefully, like Alibaba, Didi will pay the fine and be able to move on. We'll have to wait and see, of course, but that's the feeling here. One thing I will say, though, is that future Chinese IPOs, the ADRs here, the American Depository Receipts, I mean, some of those are being pulled now, and others are certainly in doubt. So it's not a happy time to be a Chinese company wanting to come to market in New York at the moment, I think, because of Didi.
And John, what more can you tell us about President Biden's $3 billion COVID rescue plan?
Well, President Biden announced within the last 12 hours or so that he's releasing $3 billion in order to community build through the form of small business. Now, this is all part of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed into law by him back on March the 11th. And so under the auspices of that, the money comes out. Commerce Department saying it could create 300,000 jobs in the near term. There are 6 programs. And among the highlights of this, 30 areas will be able to apply for money to get 8 projects underway. State, local government, universities, colleges, non-profits, unions, and some tribes will be able to apply. $100 million has been earmarked for indigenous communities, $300 million for the coal and energy sector. And they'll have the money once they've applied no later than September of 2022. So it's all part of what Biden sees as trying to move the economy out from the middle, to grow the middle class.
And John, we mentioned them yesterday, your favourite and mine, those plastic shoes are making news again.
I know. I know. What's the matter with you in London? Sweaty feet for 2 days in a row. This is great. By the way, Robin, will you do me a favour? Just look down under the desk. Is he wearing Crocs? I think he probably is.
I don't even
And if he's
need
not,
to
he will
look,
be at the
and
weekend.
I couldn't possibly reveal the answer. What goes on under the desk stays under the desk.
I think he will be at the weekend. I've been told. Anyway, so Crocs amazingly makes the news 2 days in a row. First of all, they have stellar earnings, and their forecast for the future is all very good. And their stock was up 10% yesterday. Right now, it's down about 1%, but that's okay, $131. It looks as if Americans have said, yeah, we have our freedom back. Let's go and buy some Crocs. And, you know, it's funny because Crocs have been ridiculed in many ways for a long time because they are plastic and they do make your feet sweaty. But they have become, apparently in 2020, a major source of foot fashion. The clogs have logged their best year in 2020. But now they are suing Walmart and Hobby Lobby, which is an arts and crafts store, and several others as well, for ripping off the clogs. It's a clog knockoff. They're coming up with different names for these plastic shoes, different prices, much cheaper. And Crocs say, we're not having that. So they're going after them in the courts. No comment from these other companies that sell these other plastic clogs. But, I mean, in fairness to the company, people love them. Not many companies have fans, but Crocs is one of those companies that actually has fans. People find them, I don't like them, as you know, but people find them super duper comfortable. There you go.
I'll take your word for it. John Terrett in New York, thanks very much.
John Terrett wearing Crocs under the desk. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Germany's cleanup after the floods continues, but scientists warn this will not be the last of the extreme weather.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas. Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh, no.
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The Tokyo Games begin with a spectacular opening ceremony, but the greatest show on earth will be like no other Olympics. And China's flooding death toll is rising. 56 people have now lost their lives. More than 1 million people have been displaced.
The eyes of the world, the eyes of our children are on us. COP President Alok Sharma told the G20 climate meeting that failure or even delay is not an option in the fight against global warming. The talks in Naples took place against a backdrop of extreme weather as deadly floods devastate large swathes of Europe and China. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen. Ross, ministers have been briefing the media. What are they saying?
Yeah, that's right, Jamie. These briefings coming at the end of 2 days of meetings between the G20 environment ministers and the Italian Minister for the Ecological Transition, Roberto Cingolani, has been leading this briefing, saying that we have to accelerate our plans and policies or otherwise the world temperature is going to continue to accelerate. He said that we need to strongly decarbonise our economies, and he did also say that when it comes to trying to reach agreement on energy policy, well, that's been very complex. He said there have been long discussions with Russia, India and China about trying to find convergence on that issue, but he did also say more positively that fighting climate change, that is somewhere where there has been broad agreement between the G20, the 19 biggest economies in the world, plus the European Union. He said that we have had great convergence on this topic. Also, there was great convergence on the main topic of the discussions yesterday, Jamie. That was biodiversity, trying to protect the natural environment and the species that we do have left, looking after our seas, the animals on land and the animals in the air as well. It does seem to be, though, when it comes to the sticking points, what's hard for the G20 is trying to marry the priorities of the developed nations in the G20, like the United States, the United Kingdom and France, and the concerns of the developing nations in the G20, so countries like Brazil, India and Mexico.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thank you very much.
As politicians debate what to do about climate change, people in Germany are experiencing the real-life consequences of inaction. Devastating floods have ravaged the country, killing at least 170 people. And scientists are warning this won't be the last time. Natalie Carney reports.
The waters came rushing in. One survivor says, recounting the terrifying night his entire house was engulfed by the floods.
We went out over the roof here, through the window. Here was all the water, all water, up to the top. If you had fallen in, you would have been swept away. There was such pressure on it.
The extent of the damage done by the devastating floods caused by severe storms won't be known until the end of the month, says Germany's Interior Minister. Yet, while this was a rare occurrence, scientists are not at all surprised it happened.
This did happen to be a winter with a lot of snow, so there's a lot of moisture already in the ground, and we have had a large amount of rain over many months. And the combination of all of those things, it's waiting for a flood.
More moisture is in our atmosphere as a result of decades of accumulated greenhouse gases. We have also reduced the Earth's natural forests, which would help to mitigate the impacts of our pollution, says Professor Schroers.
So imagine that the atmosphere has a blanket around it, and what we're doing is we're pumping more and more heat into that blanket. And that is, of course, impacting weather patterns. And so that can lead to extreme accumulations of moisture in some areas, and then you have these extreme rains that lead to the floods.
While cleanup efforts continue, much of the storm is now brewing over the federal government's handling of the impending catastrophe, with some politicians accusing Berlin of not doing enough to alert the people despite meteorologists' warnings. The government rejects that charge, saying the highest level of alert was issued.
The media then has to interrupt their program and read out the warning. Warning level 1 means that there is a threat to life. All of this happened and all of this worked. What I cannot influence is how this information is handled on location.
While the politicians may be the most clearly to blame in the eyes of those who have lost so much, the fact is we are all responsible for the devastating weather patterns being experienced worldwide, says Professor Schroers.
We need to be thinking about how do we change our lifestyles so that we become much less dependent on fossil fuels. And we need to think, what can we do to bring nature back?
And if we don't do those things, are we likely to see more of these severe weather patterns?
You can be pretty assured that what we've been seeing around the world this year, this will continue. The impact will be enormous. Change will be hard. It will be really hard, but it's so necessary.
Natalie Carney, CGTN, Munich.
In India, at least 67 people have died after torrential rain triggered landslides and flattened villages. Heavy rain has caused rivers to burst their banks and dams to overflow, turning roads into rivers and people to leave their homes. Thousands of lorry drivers are stuck on a highway submerged underwater. The Army and Navy are helping with rescue operations.
And hundreds of people have been moved from their homes after flash floods struck Turkey's northeastern Black Sea region for the second time in days. Rescuers have been working to bring people to safety. So far, one person is missing. Footage on social media showed a house collapsing and being washed away. Australia's Great Barrier Reef will not be placed on the World Heritage Site's in danger list after lobbying by the Canberra government. The World Heritage Committee voted to ignore a scientific report by UNESCO which said the reef was in danger from climate change, a case that had been supported by many environmental groups. CGTN's Greg Navarro reports.
Australia's government has launched a significant effort to convince enough countries that are taking place in the vote to postpone that vote for at least 2 years. It also argues that it has the best managed reef in the world, having spent billions of dollars to work on improving it. And it cites a new recent report that came out that said that new corals are actually growing in places where there was significant damage caused just a couple of years ago. The problem is that scientists say there's a shift in the type of coral that's growing in those areas that received a lot of damage, that it's more stressed, more prone to issues, and leading to a change in species as well. They also argue, along with UNESCO, that the government here has not done enough to improve water quality around that. The biggest threat that everybody seems to believe is impacting the Great Barrier Reef right now, global warming ocean waters. That's leading to, since 2015, 3 significant coral bleaching events. Those events happen when essentially warming ocean waters impact the coral's ability to protect itself. It becomes highly stressed. It's not able to protect itself. And they believe the latest coral bleaching event led to a dying off of about half of the corals on the reef, significant damage. That's why they're pushing for an endangered classification to help improve the health of the reef, prompt Australia's government to do more beyond what it's already been doing, what it's already promoting that it's doing, to, in essence, elicit significant change to lead to better outcomes for one of its greatest treasures. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Sydney.
While UNESCO had argued for the Great Barrier Reef to be placed on the in danger list, the United Nations scientific watchdog says that a greater international focus will now fall on the world's largest coral reef system.
Australia is doing big and very important work to protect the reef, but all ocean fauna and flora, they are really under danger. And because of that, the attention to that issue, I think that the UNESCO is now paying and attracting, is important. So I think it will be, a very good discussion and will result in a very good outcome. Probably more investment, more focus. So that's what is happening, I think. Attention to critical issues of Mother Nature needs to be paid, and UNESCO is the watchdog for that.
Italy is the latest European country to introduce a mandatory COVID vaccine passport, which will take effect from August. It means people will need the so-called green pass to enter venues, including indoor restaurants, cinemas and gyms. But following disagreements within the governing coalition, the certificate will not be required for transport.
The funeral of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse has taken place. It's 2 weeks since he was shot dead at home in an assassination that's still being investigated. His supporters have vented their anger in 2 days of violent protests.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead.
Lady slipper orchids similar to these can fetch thousands on the black market. Find out why some orchid species are under serious threat.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you all around the world. all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Two shipwrecks dating back to the 14th and 18th centuries have been discovered off Singapore.
Archaeologists say the discovery will help shed light on the city-state's maritime history and its role as an ancient shipping centre. CGTN's Mira Liu reports.
After lying on the seabed for centuries, two shipwrecks and their rare cargo were discovered near the island of Petra Branca, the easternmost point of Singapore. Located where Singapore Strait meets the South China Sea, Petra Branca is known to be treacherous for ships due to its rocky outcrop and shallow waters. The area is predominantly off limits, and it was an accident that led to the first wreck being found by commercial divers in 2015.
They were out there removing a steel barge that wrecked on the rock next to the lighthouse. And while they were looking for steel parts, they found ceramics instead. We did a survey, and having got to the seabed, instead of just one or two pieces that could have been wedged in amongst the rocks, we actually saw the whole seabed was carpeted in ceramic shards.
Dr. Michael Flecker, who headed the excavation on the first wreck from 2016 to 2019, found nearly 4.5 tons of ceramic shards and Longchuan greenware dating back to the early 14th century. Significantly, the vessel contained the largest collection of Yuan Dynasty blue and white porcelain ever discovered in a documented shipwreck.
This is the first ancient shipwreck found in Singapore territorial waters, and it just happened to coincide with the Temasek period, 14th century peak of Singapore's trading port. So that was wonderful in itself. On top of that, we've got individual artifacts, ceramics, that can be directly matched with some of the finds on the terrestrial sites in Singapore.
The site Dr. Flecker mentioned is part of a separate excavation project conducted in 2015. Archaeologists say this illustrates that Singapore may have been an important trade and shipping hub between the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, centuries before the Europeans arrived on its shores. Further surveys in the area around Petra Branca led Dr. Flecker and his team to the second wreck. Excavations on Shipwreck 2 were conducted from 2019 to mid-2021.
Artifacts from the shipwrecks will have to be desalinated to get rid of the salt and minerals that may cause damage. They will then be cleaned, conserved, and catalogued for further research. While their final destination will be here at the museum towards the end of the year, the discovery itself highlights Singapore's role in the region's maritime history. Mira Liu, CGTN, Singapore.
Look, but don't touch. Security staff are on alert at London's Kew Gardens to protect rare botanical plants from thieves.
Not least orchids, for which there is a thriving illegal global market threatening the survival of some species. Juliet Mann reports.
These very small yellow flowers down here are orchids, but also the big frilly white ones in the background there are also orchids.
Perhaps it's the humidity, the woody aura, the glistening beads of dew. There's something about orchids that's enchanting. And perhaps that explains the scramble for fast disappearing numbers of rare species in the wild.
We know of species of slipper orchids, for example, which have been described in Southeast Asia in recent years, where people have been to the wild populations. They've stripped out every single living plant, and that's a whole species which has just disappeared from the wild because of people's greed.
There are around 28,000 species of orchids known to science, but a recent study that looked at 1,700 orchid species found 400 were endangered, 204 critically so, and 5 are now extinct.
Demand for rare orchids dates back centuries. Victorian botanists went bonkers for blue vandas like these, sponsoring dangerous expeditions to unknown lands. They called the craze orchid delirium, but unregulated wild collection could have irreversible consequences.
Some orchids are being harvested to extinction, their edible and medicinal properties forever lost. Rare orchids are protected under the same international wildlife laws as rhinos and tigers, but stopping them being trafficked around the world is much harder.
If a box of plants comes in which aren't in flower, then most customs officers won't be able to tell you that they're orchids. They don't know whether they're orchids or some other tropical plants. If a tiger skin comes in, then it's obviously a tiger skin. If an elephant's tusk comes in, then it's obviously ivory. So there is this problem about training people to actually be able to recognise orchids.
Collectors often know just what they're looking for, which keeps Kew Gardens' security team on high alert.
We've caught people climbing over the wall, trying to break into buildings. We've also had people visiting and taking cuttings of plants.
Surveillance runs around the clock, and the rarest, most delicate orchids stay behind glass.
We don't want to lock everything away. It's nice to be able to, for the public, the paying visitors, to come in and see some of our orchids, and they're the ones that I spend my time trying to protect, to make sure we've got the right security around to protect those.
Scientists now have the tools and technology to reintroduce some rare species back into the wild. But mindful of modern orchid mania, don't expect anyone to reveal where to find them. Juliet Mann, CGTN, London.
And finally, an unexpected twist to a football match in Bolivia. A dust devil spun its way through the pitch as players gathered for a tournament final.
Often mistaken for tornadoes, dust devils are small whirlwinds that form when there's strong surface heating, picking up dust and debris as they roll over the land. While mostly harmless, they can reach speeds of up to 60 miles an hour.
The headlines again. The Tokyo Games begin with a spectacular opening ceremony, but the greatest show on earth will be like no other Olympics.
China's flooding death toll is rising. 56 people have now lost their lives. More than 1 million people have been displaced.
And growing calls for vaccinated workers to be exempt from the UK's self-isolation rules as a new wave of coronavirus forces thousands to stay at home.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching. More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. I'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.